A strong response from both sides of the aisle. Our own Mike Duffy got a chance to speak with the Democratic congressman about why now and what he hopes to achieve. Mike, good evening.
Good evening, Glenn and Simon. That's right. I got to sit down one-on-one with Congressman Tanadar today to learn more.
What just happened is a stunning moment in American politics. Trump has openly said that he will not comply with a direct order from the Supreme Court, claiming that the judiciary has no right to limit his authority. That refusal has immediately triggered impeachment action, with Representative Shri Thanadar stepping forward and calling defiance of the Supreme Court an impeachable offense. The constitutional system is no longer waiting in the background. It has started moving, and it is moving quickly. House Resolution 353 has now been formally introduced, setting out articles of impeachment against Donald Trump for high crimes and misdemeanors. The resolution has been sent to the House Judiciary Committee, where investigation, testimony, and debate will begin. This is no longer a warning about what could happen if a president crosses a dangerous line. This is now an active impeachment process already moving through the legislative branch. And the reason it is gaining momentum is simple. Trump received a lawful order from the Supreme Court, and he publicly refused to follow it. That is the center of the entire case. Now let's see the ruling that pushed this fight from legal battle into direct defiance.
So we've reported now on the protests that erupted in California over the weekend after a string of immigration raids. President Donald Trump says that he can fast-track the deportation of undocumented immigrants because they're not entitled to the same rights as American citizens. Paul Spade checks that claim for PolitiFact.
If you come to the United States illegally, do you get the same right?
The Supreme Court's ruling came after months of legal battles over Trump's immigration enforcement policies and other executive actions that lower courts had already found to be beyond the limits of presidential authority. Multiple courts had ruled that Trump's administration violated federal law, exceeded the powers Congress had granted, and removed legal protections that had to be restored. Trump fought every ruling against him. He appealed again and again, using every available legal channel until the dispute finally reached the Supreme Court. But when the Supreme Court issued its decision, the message was unmistakable. The court ordered Trump to obey the law, reinstate the policies his administration had unlawfully ended, and take real steps to bring back individuals who had been removed from the country in violation of court orders. This was not a recommendation, it was not advice, it was a direct binding order from the highest court in the United States. This next part shows why Trump's response is being treated as a direct threat to constitutional government.
Judges in the deciding vote. The court says federal law does not require the administration to send migrants it doesn't detain back to Mexico to await U.S. hearings on their asylum claims. The Supreme Court also saying the way the White House moved to end the policy last year did not violate the administrative procedure.
Trump's response is what makes this moment so dangerous. American presidents have disagreed with Supreme Court rulings before. They have criticized judges, complained about decisions, and searched for political or legislative ways to respond. Some presidents have expressed deep frustration when courts placed limits on their power. But this is different. Trump is not simply criticizing the ruling. He is refusing to obey it. He is telling the country that when the Supreme Court orders him to do something, he can decide for himself whether that order matters. That is not normal political disagreement. That is a direct challenge to the structure of constitutional government. Here is where Congress steps in and impeachment becomes the constitutional response.
These articles are incorrect. Instead, he chose to calling me lunatic and crazy. So I don't get into name calling. All I'm doing is doing my job. All I'm doing is following our Constitution and the oath of office that I took to protect and defend this Constitution. And so did Donald Trump.
That is why Representative Thander's response matters. Impeachment begins in the House, and Congress is the branch that the Constitution gives the power to check a lawless president. Congress was not designed to stand by silently when a president refuses to follow the law or defies another co-equal branch of government. It was given the authority to act when the executive branch abuses power or threatens the constitutional order. Thanadar's position is clear. If a president openly refuses to obey the Supreme Court, then Congress has both the power and the duty to respond. In this situation, impeachment is not just a political option. It is the constitutional remedy created for exactly this kind of crisis. Democrats preparing the impeachment case appear to understand how serious the moment is. Every day Trump continues refusing to comply becomes another day of constitutional violation. Every day he ignores the court strengthens the message that he believes he is above the law. And every day Congress risks sending the opposite message, that a president can attack the separation of powers and face no immediate consequence. That is why the impeachment effort is moving on several tracks at once. Lawmakers are building the legal case, gathering the evidence, organizing political support, and shaping a public argument that can reach beyond the Democratic base. They want the country to understand the issue in the clearest possible way. The Supreme Court issued a lawful order, and Trump refused to follow it. Now watch why this third impeachment could be harder for Trump to defend than the first two.
Senators, the president was impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives on January 13th for doing that. You ask what a high crime and misdemeanor is under our Constitution? That's a high crime and misdemeanor. If that's not an impeachable offense, then there is no such thing.
If this process continues, it would become Donald Trump's third impeachment. That alone shows how extraordinary his time in power has been. He was impeached once over abuse of power and obstruction of Congress connected to Ukraine. He was impeached again after the attack on the Capitol. In both cases, the House voted to impeach, but the Senate did not reach the two-thirds majority required to convict and remove him. Trump has always treated those acquittals as proof that he was vindicated, claiming the entire process was political persecution. But this time, the circumstances are different. In the earlier cases, his allies could argue over facts, intent, and interpretation. They could debate whether the Ukraine pressure campaign was a quid pro quo. They could argue whether his speech legally counted as incitement. But this case is far harder to defend. The Supreme Court gave an order. Trump publicly refused to comply. There is very little room for spin. That clarity is what makes this impeachment so threatening to Trump. Republicans who protected him before could point to disputed evidence or claim the legal standard had not been met. But defending a president who openly refuses to obey the Supreme Court is a much harder task. There is no complicated mystery at the center of the case. The facts are right in front of the country. The court ruled. The president defied. To acquit him would mean accepting the idea that a president can ignore the Supreme Court when he dislikes the decision. That is a dangerous principle, and it could be difficult even for many conservatives to defend publicly. This part explains how the crisis strikes at the foundation of the American system.
Tom Fitton runs Judicial Watch, as you well know, because he's a frequent guest on this show. He's been watching all of this, and he joins us tonight. What's the takeaway for you, Tom?
Well, it's a terrible day for the Constitution of the country. The president has been terribly abused. Our Constitution's being attacked. And, taking a step back, we have information that the United States government, more or less, was lying to us for 3 years about Russia collusion.
The crisis cuts straight into the foundation of the American system. The Constitution divides power among three branches. Congress makes the laws. The president enforces the laws. The courts interpret the laws and resolve disputes about what they mean. That system only works if each branch respects the authority of the others. When a president refuses to obey the Supreme Court, he is not just rejecting one ruling. He is rejecting the court's authority over him altogether. He is claiming that his own judgment is stronger than the law. That idea is not compatible with constitutional government. It is the logic of unchecked executive power. This moment also exposes a weakness in the judicial system that usually remains hidden. Courts can issue decisions and orders, but they cannot personally enforce those orders against a president who refuses to obey. The Supreme Court cannot deploy its own army. It cannot physically force the president to sign directives or restore policies. Its authority depends on the shared understanding that judicial rulings are binding and must be respected. When a president breaks that understanding, the Constitution leaves one major enforcement tool: Congress. Impeachment becomes the emergency mechanism, the last resort constitutional break for a president who refuses to accept lawful limits. Now let's look at the real people affected by the Supreme Court order.
Step further, you can see this transcript. He said, if people come into our country illegally, there's a different standard. And he's talking about a legal standard. But that's not what the Constitution says. The right to due process is laid out here in the Fifth Amendment. It basically means the government can't convict you of wrong.
The substance of the Supreme Court's order makes the situation even more serious because it involves real human lives. The case centered on immigration policies that courts found violated federal law and due process. Trump's administration carried out deportations without giving people the hearings they were legally entitled to. It detained individuals without required protections. It denied asylum claims without proper review. Courts determined that these actions went beyond what Congress allowed and violated basic legal safeguards. The Supreme Court ordered the administration to stop these practices, restore the protections that had been unlawfully removed, and make meaningful efforts to bring back people who had been deported in violation of court orders. These were not just legal technicalities. These were people with valid claims to remain in the United States. Some were asylum seekers who feared persecution in their home countries. Others were individuals who should have had their cases heard before they were removed. Instead, they were rushed out of the country before the legal process could be completed. Some may now be impossible to locate. Some may have gone into hiding. Some may have been imprisoned or harmed after being sent back. The damage may be impossible to fully undo. And Trump's refusal to comply adds another layer of harm because it shows contempt not only for the court, but for the people whose rights were violated. This next section shows why Trump's executive power argument does not hold up. Trump's defense is that immigration enforcement belongs to the executive branch and that courts cannot control how a president uses that authority. There is a narrow legal concept behind that argument. The executive branch does have discretion over how to enforce laws and how to prioritize resources, but discretion is not unlimited power. It does not allow a president to violate statutes passed by Congress. It does not allow him to ignore due process. It does not allow him to defy a Supreme Court order. Once the judiciary determines that the administration has broken the law, the president must comply. Anything else is not executive discretion. It is a claim that the president can place himself above the law. That is why the impeachment case is constitutionally powerful. Article 2, Section 4 allows a president to be removed for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. While the phrase has been debated for centuries, there is broad agreement that it includes serious abuses of power that threaten the constitutional order. Defying the Supreme Court fits that category directly. It attacks the rule of law. It weakens the separation of powers. It tells future presidents that court orders may be optional if they are politically inconvenient. The founders created impeachment because they feared a president who might behave like a monarch, rejecting limits and concentrating power in himself. This is exactly the kind of danger they were trying to guard against. Here is how House Resolution 353 builds the case for impeachment. House Resolution 353 appears to build its case around those constitutional principles. It lays out Trump's refusal to comply with the Supreme Court order, includes his public statements rejecting compliance, and shows that his conduct was intentional rather than accidental. It argues that this behavior amounts to high crimes and misdemeanors because it threatens the entire structure of constitutional government. Now, the resolution is before the House Judiciary Committee, where hearings can begin, witnesses can be called, evidence can be reviewed, and the committee can decide whether to recommend articles of impeachment to the full House. If Democrats remain united and the committee moves forward, the House can impeach by a simple majority, just as it did in Trump's earlier impeachments. Finally, this part shows what happens next in the Senate, in public opinion, and in history. The Senate remains the difficult part. Conviction and removal require 2/3 of the Senate, meaning that Democrats would need some Republicans to break with Trump. That is where Trump survived before. In his previous impeachment trials, Republican unity protected him from removal. But this time, the pressure may be different. It is one thing to defend Trump on a disputed phone call or a contested political speech. It is another thing to defend a president who is openly refusing to obey the Supreme Court. The conduct is public. The legal duty is clear. The danger to the system is obvious. Senators who vote to acquit will have to explain why they believe a president can ignore the highest court in the country. That creates a difficult political choice for Republicans. Voting to convict could anger Trump's most loyal supporters and invite primary challenges. But voting to acquit could damage them badly with moderates, independents, and voters who still believe the president must obey the courts. Democrats would use that vote as proof that those Republicans chose loyalty to Trump over loyalty to the Constitution. Constitution. Every senator will have to calculate which risk is greater. Some in safe red states may decide that standing with Trump is still politically easier. But in competitive states, defending open defiance of the Supreme Court could become a dangerous burden. History shows how damaging presidential defiance of the courts can be. The most famous example is Andrew Jackson and Worcester v. Georgia, when the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia could not enforce its laws on Cherokee lands. Jackson allegedly dismissed the ruling and refused to enforce it, and the consequences helped lead to the Trail of Tears, one of the most shameful chapters in American history. That episode is remembered as a warning about executive lawlessness and the human suffering it can cause. Trump's refusal to obey the Supreme Court carries a similar warning. The difference now is that Congress has the authority, the tools, and the constitutional responsibility to respond. This is why Congress is now at the center of the crisis. The Supreme Court has already done its part. It reviewed the case, it issued a ruling, it gave a binding order. Trump refused. The judiciary has reached the limit of what it can do on its own. Now the responsibility moves to the legislative branch. Congress must decide whether the Constitution has real force or whether a president can make it meaningless by refusing to comply. If Congress fails to act, it tells future presidents that the courts can be ignored. If Congress acts decisively, it confirms that no president can place himself above the law. The timing makes the stakes even higher. With elections approaching, every member of Congress will eventually have to answer for their vote. Democrats will frame any vote to protect Trump as a vote for presidential lawlessness. They will argue that Republicans who defend him are choosing one man over the Constitution. That message could be powerful in competitive districts and swing states because the issue is easy to understand. Voters do not need to be legal experts to understand that a president should obey the Supreme Court. Conviction is still difficult because it would require a significant number of Republicans to join Democrats. But compared with Trump's previous impeachments, this case may be more politically dangerous for him because the violation is so straightforward. In the past, Republicans could argue that the evidence was contested or that removal was too extreme. Here, the central question is simple. Can a president refuse to obey the Supreme Court? If the answer is yes, then the entire system of checks and balances becomes weaker. If the answer is no, then impeachment and removal become the constitutional response. The consequences reach far beyond Trump personally. If he defies the Supreme Court and survives without consequences, future presidents will learn from that example. Court rulings would become more like suggestions than commands. The judiciary's authority would depend on whether the president felt like listening. Separation of powers would become optional. That is how democratic systems begin sliding toward authoritarian rule. But if Congress impeaches and the Senate convicts, the system proves it can still defend itself. It sends a message to every future president that Supreme Court orders are binding and that ignoring them can end a presidency. The public battle will matter just as much as the legal one. Americans are watching the branches of government collide in real time. They are deciding whether this is a political fight or a direct attack on the rule of law. Polling in the coming weeks could influence how lawmakers behave. If public opinion turns strongly against Trump, Republican senators may feel real pressure to support conviction. If the country remains locked into partisan camps, many Republicans may stay with him. That is why the hearings will be so important. They will be the stage where lawmakers explain the ruling, the refusal, the history, and the constitutional danger. The House Judiciary Committee hearings could become a major public lesson in how the Constitution works. Witnesses may explain why Supreme Court orders are binding, why presidential compliance matters, and why impeachment exists as a remedy for a president who rejects lawful limits. The hearings will also likely highlight the people harmed by the immigration policies at the center of the case, showing that this is not just about institutional power, but about real lives affected by unlawful government action. The clarity and seriousness of those hearings could determine whether public support grows. If the case reaches a Senate trial, it could become one of the most important constitutional confrontations in modern American history. Senators would sit in judgment of a president accused of refusing to obey the Supreme Court itself. The country would watch. The world would watch. Allies would ask whether American institutions remain strong enough to protect democracy.